I'm going to mute myself. So just want to say hello to everybody.
Yeah, I probably need to do the same thing.
All right, well, it's 12:05. So Kathy, are you going to kick us off here?
Kathy Harding is kicking us off.
Yep.
Kathy Harding, yes.
I had to unmute myself. So anyway, yes, thank you and welcome everybody to the first ever Women's Chamber Network program. And you may all be aware, or maybe not, that the KCK Women's Chamber of Commerce, which celebrated our 100-year anniversary this year, has joined with the KCK Chamber in a collaborative effort to establish the new Women's Chamber Network. And so we're very excited about that. It will be programming specifically for women in business and in service to their communities. We hope to have at least 12 different events, various kinds of events during the year for all levels of women in business, CEO types, vice presidents, to people who are just starting out in their careers, and everything in between. So we'll have some learning opportunities and also some fun events. So check the KCK Chamber's website frequently to see what upcoming events there are. But in the meantime, we did, before we have today's program, did think it was important to recognize the 100-year anniversary this year of the KCK Women's Chamber of Commerce. That's a long time to be in existence, 100 years. And we were formed right after we earned the right to vote. So there were some very courageous, strong, visionary women at the time and have been throughout the years. So before we move on to the program, we thought you might enjoy a short video that was made to celebrate the Women's Chamber of Commerce and the anniversary. So Caitlin, are you going to launch that for us?
The establishment of the Women's Chamber of Commerce was at a time where there was no place for women to really belong, to be included. And so that's powerful in itself, I think.
You know, the group was organized in 1920, filed their official paperwork early in the 30s, but in conjunction with being able to get the right to vote, local women decided, well, if we can vote, we need to have a better voice. Let's get together, let's support each other.
They didn't wait for someone else to come and bring it to them. They took the initiative and they said, we're going to do it. We're going to make it happen.
And the key phenomenon, you can look now at Wyandotte County at people in elected positions and see the Women's Chamber handiwork. You see our veterans there.
The Women's Chamber was so beneficial. And if you were a good member, meaning you attended, you worked on committees, they really opened up the system of advancement through the organization. And it was really helpful for me in a political and personal way, because in 1989, I decided to run for city council. During my campaign, it was myself as the candidate, female, my campaign manager, female, the treasurer, female, and my yard signs were hot pink. And I don't think some of the men really knew how to act accordingly. No offense, gentlemen, but that's the way it was.
When I was elected chairman of the chamber, there'd be times I'd be sitting in a meeting and the man to the right of me would have some little something that he wanted to share with the guy on the left of me, and they would literally pass around me to hand it over, like I wasn't even there. I was invisible to them. And I made it my pleasure that year to volunteer for everything.
You know, we always think that the good old boy network is what makes these things happen, but it was these strong women who made it happen for me. And so, you know, I think without them, I wouldn't be where I'm at, and I'm thinking most of you wouldn't be where you're at either.
Throughout the history of the Women's Chamber, giving back has always been an important part of the organization, and that continued. And as times changed, what that philanthropic need was changed.
We had a lot of women coming in the library looking for assistance with job applications and so forth. So I suggested to the committee that we reconsider the way we handled our scholarship program and considering offering those scholarships to the non-traditional
And in fact, in 2015, we established the KCK Women's Chamber Foundation, a true standalone 501c3 to continue to support those women, and that will continue beyond.
One of the proudest moments for me was when the KCK Chamber Board actually moved to create a new division that's truly dedicated to women. I was asked to present the proposal to the board, and at the end I said, we were formed at a time when women were not included in anything, and the era of exclusion is over. And the thing I'm proud about is that the motion that was made that day was made in the spirit of inclusion.
Yeah, I think the chamber has focused a lot of attention on the business development aspect of it and the professional development aspect of it. And then we know that the Women's Chamber has really focused on a much broader perspective on health issues and women's issues, as well as business issues. So combining these two really create some synergies there that we can then lift all, it's lifting everything and making all those efforts have much more impact for the community.
If it hadn't been for the Women's Chamber, I don't know that we would be here today in the capacity that we are here today. We're at the table, we have a seat, we're making decisions, and we're winning.
Yeah. And a big shout out to Tico Productions, who developed this film, this video. They spent a lot of time on it and reviewed a lot of historical documents to be able to share in the video. So a huge shout out to Tico Productions for the video that they put together for this. In some ways, we've come a long way, and in others, we have a long ways to go. But we thought that today's program would be especially relevant because, of course, it's about women and voting. So Kathy Honor, I will turn it over to you to introduce our program today.
Hey, I'm excited to introduce Jen Johnson to you. She's going to talk about a pop-up exhibit that actually I had ordered and had that talks about the suffrage movement and that, and thought we would have at all of our events this year, be able to showcase in that. Unfortunately, it's in my office, but expect to see it next year. So Jen Johnson is a curator and has worked for National Archives since 2003. For the past 4 years.
Oh. Kathy, you're muted.
Really? So was I muted the whole time?
Almost.
You didn't even hear me talk about having the exhibit or anything?
We heard that. We heard that.
Okay.
We heard that.
All right. So Jen Johnson is curator and has worked for the National Archives since 2003. For the past 4 years, she's worked in Kansas City for the museum program. Her most recent projects include the Rightfully Hers pop-up display and the traveling exhibition, One Half of the People, Advancing Equality for Women, which is touring the country through 2022. So we're probably going to have her back to talk about that one in the future as well. So welcome, Jen Johnson.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here today. As Kathy said, I work for the National Archives. I've been a curator for the museum for about 16 years, and I started as an archivist in the Fort Worth office, moved to DC, then came to Kansas City. So I've worked in a few different positions for the National Archives. And in the end today, I hope I can share with you a kind of deep dive into women's voting rights history as seen through National Archives records, and introduce you to the types of records or what that means. So let me just share my screen. Okay, actually, hold on. I'm getting there. Okay, I think that's, yep, there we go. Sorry about that. I even practiced that too. So to start, the Rightfully Hers is the title of the National Archives National Commemoration of the 19th Amendment. And the museum has produced 3 exhibits that explore the history of women's voting rights. 2 of those were produced here in Kansas City. We have a small exhibits team here. The main exhibition is in DC. It's in our special exhibition gallery, and it's called Rightfully Hers, American Women and the Vote. And then Kathy mentioned the pop-up and the traveling exhibit, and I'll get to the pop-up at the end and show you what that looks like. But first, the National Archives and Records Administration. We are a federal agency, and we are the nation's record keeper of all the documents and materials created by the federal government, by federal government agencies. Only about 1 to 3% are preserved for us for historical or legal reasons. And we're in the forever business. Our mandate is to preserve them for forever. As the nation's record keeper, we are a network of archives of presidential libraries and record centers located across the country. I believe we're at 44 facilities right now, of which almost all are closed, and the ones that are open in a very limited capacity because of COVID regulations. The National Archives Museum, which you see here in this photo, is this is a photo of the rotunda where we have on display what we call our big 3, the Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. Those are available for museum visitors to see every day that we're open, which is every day but Christmas and Thanksgiving. And today, though, this presentation, we're going to go beyond the rotunda, beyond those, what we call the charters of freedom, but beyond those documents to explore women's voting rights. And I'm going to start back at the beginning. When our Constitution, when our founders drafted the Constitution in 1787, they made no mention of women. Women at the time were generally excluded from political and in many ways public life, and enslaved women were excluded entirely. So what does that mean? It means women could not vote, they could not own property, women could not make contracts or go to court, they couldn't control money they earned, they couldn't go to college, and they couldn't serve on a jury, and the list goes on. Nevertheless, as we've just seen, women everywhere have always participated. Historically, from the beginning, we have evidence of that. And these 2 petitions are just a couple among the thousands that have been submitted to Congress on behalf of issues submitted by women's groups that they were advocating for on many topics. Topics such as the abolition movement, temperance, working conditions, public education, in addition to women's voting rights. So on the left, this petition for universal suffrage was submitted in 1866. It was submitted in hopes of a 16th Amendment. And it was part of the first national drive for women's voting rights. And I know it's really hard to see these documents, so I'm gonna read from the document. It says, declaring we are governed without our consent. Therefore, as you are now amending the Constitution and in harmony with advancing civilization, placing new safeguards around the individual rights of 4 million emancipated slaves, we ask that you extend the right of suffrage to women, the only remaining class of disenfranchised citizens, and thus fulfill your constitutional obligation to guarantee to every state in the Union a Republican form of government. This one was signed by some of the most prominent advocates at the time. On the top left is Elizabeth Cady Stanton's signature, followed by Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, and more. On the right is a petition from 1877, and it is signed by Frederick Douglass's children. Frederick Douglass was one of the only men who attended and signed the Declaration of Sentiments in 1848, which is credited as being the first public declaration for women's voting rights. and his children were also advocates and activists. This petition from 1877 was submitted with other Black residents of the District of Columbia asking Congress to, and I quote from the petition, to prohibit states from disenfranchising United States citizens on account of sex. So both of his children signed. You can see Frederick Douglass Jr. on the top left. They divided the signatures by men and women. And his daughter, who was a suffragist and one of the founding members of the National Association of Colored Women, signed on the right as Mrs. Nathan Sprague. Her name was Rosetta Douglass Sprague. Other records in our holdings, in addition to petitions, women wrote articles, gave speeches, and organized marches to gain support for women's voting rights. And these two images are from, excuse me, let me just take a drink of water. These two images are from the Women's Suffrage March, which was held in Washington, D.C. in 1913. And they're found in our legislative holdings, or our congressional holdings, because they were collected as evidence by a Senate committee investigating the mistreatment of the marchers. More than 100 witnesses testified about women being verbally and physically harassed and often unable to proceed. And I don't know if you can see very well, but on the photo on the right, that's Pennsylvania Avenue stretching out before us in the Capitol at the background. And the march route in theory would take up all of Penn Avenue, but if you can see, it's just completely crowded. And the march route is just a little narrow strip in that street. So they were effectively prevented from marching peacefully. And the Senate committee ruled that they had been, and the current DC superintendent of police was removed. So because of the women's suffrage movement, there was progress. And many states had passed voting rights laws for women before the ratification of the 19th Amendment. This graphic is not from the National Archives, but we used it in the traveling exhibit, One Half the People. And I just think it's a really good visual to kind of show that patchwork of voting rights that women experienced, because it wasn't consistent. However, it must be noted that before the 19th Amendment, there were women who did have access to the polls. The first state to do that was New Jersey in 1797, very early on. But by 1807, they had rescinded that right, and only free white males were allowed to vote. But beginning in 1890, and for the next few decades, several states granted some level of voting rights to women. Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Idaho, California, Kansas in 1912, Montana, Oregon, Nevada, and more. But it was decades of activity, and the fight to win women the right to vote was not easily or quickly won. A diverse group of suffragists fought for more than 70 years to get a constitutional amendment. This photo is from our holdings, and it's 16 women marching in front of the White House. It's from 1917. They're trying to compel President Wilson to publicly speak on women's voting rights. And they were later arrested for this protest. But what I want to point out about this is that they were just one day of almost 8 months of sustained activity outside the White House. It was actually women's suffrage activists who were the first people to protest outside the White House. And this was one day out of a concerted campaign organized by the National Women's Party. Today we know them as the League of Women Voters, but that for almost 8 months, they were able to station women every day outside the White House in an effort to gain support. And many of those days, the women were arrested. And as all this is happening, the women's voting rights movement certainly was not immune to the same issues that plague the nation. And the movement was largely a segregated effort of suffragists. Women of color played an important and active role in the voting rights movement, but were not always welcome in the white-led suffrage meetings and organizations. And specifically, Black women formed a national organization called the National Association of Colored Women. And it was really an umbrella organization that brought together hundreds of Black women's clubs nationwide. And in addition to voting rights, Black women's clubs played an integral part in their community in agitating for better working conditions and wages and public education. But they were an immense part of the movement in gaining support nationwide. The photo at the top is from a 1903 meeting in Kansas of the National Association of Colored Women. We use this photo in the pop-up, even though, again, it's not from the National Archives. And then the photo below, which is from the Library of Congress, is a group of women. It's a women's league group from Rhode Island. On the right is Native American lawyer and suffragist Marie Louisa Botnu Baldwin. She was a prominent advocate on behalf of Native Americans, but was also an active suffragist, and she lived in DC and was at that 1913 parade that you just saw photos of. This photo, she worked for the government. She was appointed by Theodore Roosevelt to be a clerk in the Office of Indian Affairs, and this is from her personnel file, and she chose to wear her traditional clothing the day the photos were taken. So eventually all these players and groups were starting to make progress. Certain states had started to pass voting rights legislation, but there was also a growing and active campaign to prevent a federal amendment. And varying motives in different parts of the country fueled an organized anti-suffrage movement. And many of them stemmed from fears about women's collective political power as a voting bloc, which that never materialized. You know, the movement continued, and by within a few years, the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage had chapters in 25 states. But the movement continued, and it continued to gain momentum, and major political organizations were united in their goal to have a federal amendment. In 1919, both houses of Congress passed the 19th Amendment, proposing full voting rights for women, and sent it to the states. And I just want to point out the photo of these women. One is a woman outside the White House. This is in 1917. And then the photo on the right is of Harriet Stanton Blatch. She was a second generation suffragist. Her mother was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And Harriet was very involved in New York State's efforts. And once New York State granted women the right to vote in 1917, Harriet joined the national effort. Here she's speaking on Wall Street. So in 1919, both houses of Congress have passed the 19th Amendment and sent it to the states. I just want to note this is 71 years after Harriet's mother drafted the Declaration of Sentiments in Seneca Falls, and where they had more than 100 people sign that in the first kind of public declaration of voting rights for women. But within a year, or less than a year, by March of 1920, only one more state was needed. And on August 18th, 1920, after calling a special session of their state legislature, Tennessee approved or voted to add the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. So at the time, Tennessee was the 36th state, or crossed the threshold needed to have an amendment added. And the 19th Amendment became part of our Constitution. I want to take a moment to talk about amendments versus laws. The founders made it hard, but not impossible to change the Constitution. And they gave us a mechanism. The Article 5 of the Constitution is what outlines the amending process. And for amendments to pass, you need 2/3 of both houses of Congress to vote for it, as well as 3/4 of the states. So what is needed is widespread and sustained consensus. And the 19th Amendment's timeline kind of shows you that process. Between the First Amendment proposing women's voting rights in 1869 to the amendment that Congress voted on in 1919, more than 900 proposals for women's voting rights were issued in Congress. And it took 50 years before Congress could agree on the wording or agree on the concept, et cetera. There were a variety of suggestions. An 1878 proposed amendment, and I quote from the amendment, proposed that widows and spinsters should be allowed to vote, but married women are taken care of. The assumption being that their vote was taken care of through their husbands. And then acts of Congress or laws need just a simple majority in both houses. And then it goes to the president's desk for signature. So the ratification of the 19th Amendment was a landmark moment in history that dramatically changed our electorate. And it enshrined in our Constitution fuller citizenship for women. But it wasn't universal. And after the 19th Amendment, millions of women remained unable to vote. Within years of it being added to the Constitution, discriminatory state laws, intimidation tactics, and violence in many states, southern states, effectively prevented women of color from voting. And it would take 45 more years and the modern civil rights movement to sustain the support needed for the Voting Rights Act. These two photos are from our holdings. The one in the middle is from, it was submitted to Congress in 1964. It's a photo of a voter registration site in Mississippi, and the caption notes that the fire department never came. The photo on the right is from a women's suffrage day parade and was taken by a photographer from the EPA. Eventually though, there was enough support in Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act, which is a landmark voting rights victory in that it outlawed discriminatory voting laws and it outlawed practices designed to keep people from the polls. In 2013, there were many provisions of the act that were struck down by the Supreme Court, but when it was passed, the VRA enfranchised millions of voters. And again, I know because you can't see, I just want to read that it says an act, and then it's formally titled an act to enforce the 15th Amendment of the United States Constitution. And it empowered the Attorney General to supervise states that were using tests and devices to prevent people from registering to vote. And after the Voting Rights Act, registration continued. In fact, millions of women and African Americans registered to vote after the Voting Rights Act. And this photo is from a 1971 voter registration drive. But the 100 years since the ratification of the 19th Amendment have seen voting rights expanded to millions more women, and as ongoing struggles against discrimination have succeeded, however, people continue to fight to expand and protect those rights today. And I do want to finish at least this part. If anyone has any questions, I certainly am going to stay. But to finish, I want to show you the pop-up display. This was one of those projects or exhibits that the museum created as part of our nationwide commemoration of the 19th Amendment. And it was a really helpful piece in maximizing outreach for the archives. And I think, COVID, of course, has certainly restricted a lot of this for everyone, but its goal is to introduce people to and make them aware of these documents, but also this history that is ours. And that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, if it allows people to reflect or appreciate the work of previous generations, and then also, be aware of what's happening today. That was the second goal. But more than 4,000 of these have been sent out to participating sites in all 50 states. And that includes museums and libraries, retirement homes, schools, community centers, and a whole variety of sites. But that is my presentation, and I thank you again for letting me speak today.
Thank you so much, Jen. I'll just open it up now. If anyone has any questions, I learned a lot. I always kind of wonder how the League of Women Voters got started, and now I know. So that's pretty amazing. But also amazing that it was still 1965 before we had completely universal ability to vote without discrimination of any kind. So anyway, does anyone have any questions? Feel free to just jump in and unmute and ask if you would.
Jen, that was great. Thank you so much for sharing that. In light of the pandemic and all the things that we weren't able to do, I know that I'm part of a group that was wanting to educate our young people about the 19th Amendment. And of course, all of our plans kind of went kapoo when we couldn't do some of these things. Is there, those two displays you just showed looked wonderful. Is there any way to get some of those displays and then maybe even begin to rotate them among our schools or libraries locally?
I wish we had more to give. We have accommodated for all units that we've printed. However, what we did do was we made, and I know this doesn't quite help with what you were saying, was to get a unit and spread it, but we did on our Rightfully Hers website on the National Archives, we have basically high resolution posters of each side of that pop-up. So you could print those out and hang them, or you could even try to, fabricate just a simple display to put them on. But it's available. It's in the public domain. There's no request or permission needed. But that was in an effort to address the overwhelming requests that we received to get a pop-up. So I'm sorry to say I don't have any to ship you, which I wish I did, because our biggest demographic that out of the 4,100 units that were shipped out, more than half or just about half went to schools of all levels, elementary through college campuses. I mean, they really do go far and wide. So check out the website. It might at least be an option for some sites to print them out and be able to hang them. Libraries have used them near books. And I know a lot of teachers incorporate some of the panels in like a lesson plan activity. So maybe the posters might be useful.
And also, Renee, for something special, I do have the pop-up exhibits. I had ordered those and was going to use them for Women's Chamber all year to celebrate the 100-year anniversary along with the suffrage and that. So you can reach out to me at United Way and that. If it's, some special things in that you want those exhibits for, I am certainly happy to share them.
I just was looking at the chat. I saw one question asking about the Rightfully Hers title. Titles are tough. I tell you what, they are tough. But Rightfully Hers came, the curator for the DC exhibit and I worked a lot together between the three projects because we wanted to make sure they were all complementary, and we certainly shared research, et cetera. But the Rightfully Hers came from actually a children's book about women's voting rights, and it was called Rightfully Ours. And I was on the phone, her name's Corrine. I was on the phone with Corrine and we were like, we've got to come up with something concise, but 19th Amendment Constitution, all that's a lot of syllables. It takes a lot of time to say it. And it was Corrine who said, well, what about Rightfully Hers? And that was the end. We had our title for just about everything that the National Archives did regarding the 19th Amendment.
I'm curious that, there were, of course, parts of the country that did not vote to ratify. And it sounds like other areas of the country that continue to push back against it even after it was ratified. Were they pockets or were they regions of the country that seemed to have the biggest pushback on this, or was it just various states here and there?
I would say it was definitely pockets. I mean, there was, a lot of Southern, even voting on the 19th Amendment in 1919. So there was a huge contingent that was against it. But after the fact, it definitely, I think, was different pockets. And that's the nature of, at least with amendments versus laws, the 19th Amendment didn't solve everything. I mean, it removed the issue of gender from restricting the polls, but there were many other reasons why women were kept from the polls. And however, it was, though, a statement, or there was enough support nationwide that we were willing to change our constitution to make sure that states couldn't pass those laws, at least restricting it based on gender. And then, of course, we've continued with the civil rights movement to chip away at the other barriers. But yeah, I would say it's often, based on like regions or areas.
I have another question. Having done all this study, what do you think are the biggest issues that are still needing to be solved, that lie before us in this way that we need to be aware of?
As far as voting rights, I would, having studied the Constitution for 17 years and then spent the last 15 years trying to find documents to talk about it, or at least introduce people to what these documents mean or why they're important for our democracy. For me, there's a couple reforms that have been attempted since the beginning, but you guys might shake your head since we're in the middle of a presidential election year. But since the Constitution was written, there have been calls to amend the Electoral College. I mean, from day one to even the most recent Congresses, the most recent sessions of Congress, Electoral College. The other thing is gerrymandering. The system is weak in that sense. And I think the idea that the founders gave us, this construct, they gave us 4 pages of a structure of government, but they knew that future generations would have to incorporate new ideas into this document. And that's what I think is so powerful about talking about amendments, is because they wanted us to be able to peacefully change this document, this form of government that was largely an experiment, and things like the Electoral College they invented. So I think time has shown over 225 plus years that not everything they wrote maybe works as well as they hoped it would. But for me, that would be number one. I won't keep rambling. I could probably ramble all day. And the other thing too is term limits. In my mind, there's a lot of apathy, I think, in the country about even voting, or why does my vote matter? And I think it's because they see the same senators or Congress people, like, term limits is another part of the system that we haven't addressed, because the 3 things that our 27 amendments have tackled are rights related issues, how we structure our government, and the powers of our government. So amendments, there have been more than 11,000 proposed. So just to make that point again about how high the bar is, and only 27 have registered as with enough importance or with enough support to actually warrant changing the Constitution. So I know I kind of went beyond your question, but.
Well, that's exactly what I'm thinking, because you're speaking to a group of particularly women that are in leadership roles and wanting to continue to support women in gaining an opportunity to grow and expand and lead and influence. So I was curious, voting, but along with anything else that we need to be aware of to continue to help the young ladies that come before us or sit next to us now, and how we can help promote them.
So to add on to that question, I guess, Jen, the couple things that you just mentioned, term limits and the Electoral College, does your crystal ball tell you if those things are likely to change anytime, or do you think that would just be too heavy of a lift, whether you agree for them to be changed or not? I'm just curious whether you think that either of those may happen over time.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly still hold out optimism that they will. I think just having studied different Congresses throughout the different, years of our history, I mean, I've done deep dives on the Civil War amendments, the Bill of Rights, so really kind of different eras of our country. And I would say what is unique to what I see now is the lack of like consensus on any issue. So those are big ones that need heavy lifting. And I hold out hope that somewhere we'll manage to kind of come back and have consensus on something. But it does take a lot. Like we've been now almost 50 years without a proposed amendment by Congress. So I believe I should have looked at these before we had this meeting, but the most recent one was signed in 1992. And I don't want to confuse things too much, but weirdly, it was proposed in the very first Congress. So it was on the books for 200 plus years before Congress voted on it. And it was about congressional pay. I'll just say that. It's basically like current Congress can't decide their pay. It has to be a future Congress or something like that. But from its kind of soup to nuts timeline, it's been 50 years. And I believe it was lowering the voting age to 18 was our most recent amendment. But it's been a while. So constitutional scholars would say we're due for something, and we're due for this 21st century generation to have, you know, something that they incorporate into the document. But as far as my crystal ball says at this point, I have no predictions.
Any other questions? So I'll ask one last one, and I apologize for taking this much time, but you know, there's a lot of coverage this year in particular, I think, of women's importance in the vote in this election. And for whatever reason, a lot of that is focused on suburban women. I'm not entirely sure why, but at any rate, you know, do you feel like that women now are in a position where we do have the voice that was intended by the 19th Amendment being passed?
Yes, I think so. And I think what's key to that is that women know they have their voice. So I feel like that's especially key to that. And that's getting a little bit to the apathy that I mentioned. I get why people haven't. And for many reasons, as you were talking about earlier, people are galvanized to vote, and we're seeing it now. And I think especially as a demographic or a group, women have the voice, and I think they know they have the voice.
So we have come a long way, baby.
I think so. There's some work to be done, but I think so. I mean, just listing off the things that women couldn't do, that lasted a long time. I mean, as you noted before the 4-minute, I mean, it lasted a long time into the 20th century. I mean, the lack of women having a role cast a very long shadow into our country's history. And the last state to restrict serving on a jury, women serving on a jury because they were too emotional or couldn't, you know, handle a complex legal argument was 1966.
Oh my God.
So we have come a long way. I do say that. I'll be the first to say that. I spend a lot of time reading about different chapters in our history, but I think seeing the struggles that have been overcome, that's why I hold out optimism, because we do have a system that was built to be fluid to the newest generation's needs.
Right. Well, if there are no other questions, I would like to thank everyone for attending today. I thought it was really fascinating. And just a little plug, the Women's Chamber Foundation, which you learned about in the video that we saw earlier, is holding its annual fundraising event for scholarships for non-traditional women who are going back to college to further their educations. And that is November the 12th. And Kathy or Angela, if the two of you might want to just let people know how they can participate in that before we close out.
Well, it's a virtual event this year. Unfortunately, we can't get together as we normally do, but it's November 12th. The virtual event will be 6:30 to 7. The auction actually will start on the 9th, November 9th, and then close that evening on the 10th. You can find our Facebook page. We have the event page. Katie, is it up on the chamber page yet? A link to the auction page? If not, we'll get it up there really soon. But you can go out and find it on our Facebook page, and that a link. There's already some of the purses up there. They're still coming in. There's also a 50-50 raffle. You can go ahead and start buying raffle tickets now. And so again, all of this money just supports students that are non-traditional female students. When we say non-traditional, sometimes I wish there was a better phrase for that, but it's women who are later in life going back. And when I say later, they might be 25, but they're later going back where there's not as much scholarship opportunity monies out there and that as there is when they're going directly from high school into a college. And so this helps. And sometimes that $1,000 or $1,500 they get really makes the difference on whether or not they can go. A lot of times they're, working people and that it makes a big difference. And not only that, one of the things we get back from them too is how supported they feel that there's women out there, us, business women out there that are supporting them to continue their education as well. Angela, you have anything to add?
The link to the auction website is in the comments. You can register, you can buy raffle tickets now, and bidding for purse packages will start November 9th.
And Kathy, your point about the women feeling very supported, we got a really nice thank you note from one of our scholarship recipients this year, basically saying, "You helped make my dream come true." So if those of you who are on this event today want to help some women make their dream come true, please participate in that event.
And one thing, I just want to have one more thing. I forgot. Sarah Plake is going to be our MC, and she's Channel 41 News. But we're also getting a little bit of video and some from our past speakers and that. Some of you remember Dawn Rattan from a couple years ago. Danny Boatwright's going to pop in a little bit and maybe talk a little bit about her last jaunt on Survivor. And we're hoping a couple other speakers, we're working on them too, to kind of have them come back as well. So they'll be fun to tune in.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that wraps it up for today. You have an extra about 5 minutes of your day that will let you out early. But again, thank you everybody for attending today. Have a great week and please vote.
Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, Jen. It's good to see everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you
Take
so
care.
much.